Welcome back to OtakuDaiKun. Dai here, and today I really need to vent my frustration with the latest Code Geass series, Rozé of the Recapture. It's been years since the previous work in the franchise, Lelouch of the Resurrection, and I had high hopes for this new one. Unfortunately, those hopes were dashed, and then some. Honestly, the only thing I can really congratulate Rozé for is its gorgeous visuals and attractive character designs. Its plot, however, has more holes than Lelouch's mom. For today, I encourage you to dive into my mind, to interpret this beautiful mess through my sense of logic. Before we can even get to Rozé, it's worth catching up on where the Code Geass story left off years prior. Personally, I consider the original anime and its ending to be a masterpiece. Our anti-hero Lelouch finally reconciles with his friend Suzaku, and together they aim for world peace. Their plan, the Zero Requiem, is basically to have Lelouch conquer the entire world as a wretched tyrant. With everyone hating him, he would then have Zero, a figure of rebellion and justice, run him through. Lelouch's death gives the world a cause to celebrate. In the aftermath, the majority of the planet gathers to form the United Federation of Nations, and the Black Knights are installed as global peacekeepers. Thematically, it was brilliant. Even though Lelouch did thwart his father Charles and Britannia's reign of terror, he did so through deception and ruthless tactics. On a utilitarian scale of morality, it's hard to know for sure if people would have been better off before he started his rebellion. Still, Lelouch was willing to match his conviction with his life. As a dark knight of sorts, he would save the day, but not stick around to enjoy it. One might say creating a sequel that continues Lelouch's story is an insult to his honorable sacrifice, but we've already passed that bridge. The creators smartly decided that the original series would have its own continuity, and through a series of recap films, they created a new timeline where Lelouch isn't actually dead. The idea of permanent world peace is pretty naive after all. Not everyone wanted the war to end, and we see that in the case of Shanma and her country. They profited as mercenaries for the war, and now that it's over, they struggle to make ends meet. Thus, Shamna becomes the antagonist, trying to reignite the conflict. In other words, Lelouch didn't establish world peace at all, so why should he have to stay dead when there's still work to do? Luckily, through some Seas World magic stuff, C2 is able to resurrect Lelouch, and he comes to the rescue to defeat Shamna. That brings up the question, where do we go from here? With Lelouch alive again, what direction should the story take? A proposal is given at the film's end, in which a gray orb in Seas World, presumably an amalgamation of people's regrets, explodes. What exactly happens is super fucking vague, but in the real world, it results in things called Geass fragments scattering across the planet. Lelouch, now calling himself L2 for having both a code of immortality and a Geass, sets out on a journey with C2. They plan to search for people who inherit Geass from the fragments, to make sure the Geass powers aren't used irresponsibly. With how last minute that reveal is, surely that's where we'd want a sequel to flesh things out, right? Well, as far as I can tell, the Code Geass mobile games don't make things any clearer, and Rozé sure as hell doesn't do anything to resolve our dramatic questions either. Instead, Rozé finds a way to return to the status quo. Stories like Akito the Exiled worked because they were set during and alongside the original series, when Britannia was still a major threat. In a post-Zero Requiem world, it becomes way harder to justify that sort of conflict, and I don't think Rosé's setup is even remotely plausible. Instead, it uses some of the strangest plot mechanics to justify bringing Britannians back as the main villains. Essentially, a large force of Neo-Britannians target Japan again, taking control of the entire island of Hokkaido. The Japanese are back to being treated like 11s, and it's now up to a new hero, Sakuya Sumeragi, to save them. Now, the idea of there being Britannian sympathizers isn't surprising, but how could they possibly get away with their occupation when the world is protected by the UFN and Black Knights? I get that not all countries chose to join the United Federation, but surely the Zero Requiem would have at least prevented this sort of takeover, right? Well, it all has to do with a device called well, I'm gonna go ahead and call it the Stimpy Barrier. I don't care how it's actually pronounced because the entire concept is stupid as fuck. Basically, the people of Hokkaido were so sick of being subjugated by Britannia that they built a completely impenetrable force field around the island meant to keep invaders out. The full extent of this is never clarified, though we do see it later acting as a sort of EMP emitter that instantly shuts down all machines that try to pass through it. Somehow, despite having this barrier whenever they needed it, the Japanese in Hokkaido let these Neo-Britannians slip in and commandeer it. The very shield meant to protect them becomes a cage, trapping them in with the exact enemy they wanted to keep out. The Neo-Britannians quickly took over, imprisoning the existing government and treating the Japanese like trash all over again. It's like everything Lelouch fought for has been undone, at least for this one area. Their occupation lasts for 4 entire years, during which the UFN and Black Knights can't do a goddamn thing because of the barrier. This whole ordeal sparks far too many unanswered questions. The main one being, how the hell did the Neo-Britannians get inside? Was it a stealth operation? Were some agents sent in through the barrier as ordinary civilians, and then deactivated it from the inside? If that were possible, what's stopping agents from the UFN from sneaking in and doing the same thing? That, and it's not like the Neo-Britannians came empty-handed. They've got the Damocles, the massive floating fortress from the original show. Apparently, it's a duplicate, which explains how they got their hands on what should now be a tool for the UFN. Was Hokkaido too trusting? Did they see the Damocles as an allied vessel and open up the barrier for them, not knowing the enemy had an exact replica? That would be plausible, except for the fact that the Neo-Britannians shouldn't even have access to that level of technology. How could something this big and advanced be constructed in secret? It's even armed with Flea missiles from the OG anime. You know, those bombs that can each kill millions of innocent civilians. In order to justify the Neo-Britannian takeover, we have to accept a massive security breach on part of both the UFN and Hokkaido. Another weird issue is that the Stimpy barrier only works around the Hokkaido region. Why not have it extend to all of Japan? I know they started calling it the United States of Japan, but it seems dumb that they were only willing or able to protect one of the islands. Perhaps they were testing the barrier on Hokkaido and planned on expanding later. The issue with all of this is that it's not developed. The amount of stuff you'd need to cover just to get the Neo-Britannians in power again could be enough to fill an entire episode, movie, or season, and yet it's explained in only a fraction of the time it takes me to speculate. We also have to consider the endgame. You'd think this would be a terrible political strategy for Neo-Britannia. By taking an entire island hostage, you'd be painting a target on your back. My assumption is that Japan is rich with sakuradite, and with it, the Neo-Britannians can develop a countermeasure during those 4 years. They can build whatever nasty weapons they want, and nobody can interfere. Not from the outside, anyway. Of course, one thing that's incredibly suspicious about this is how Hokkaido would have to be self-sufficient for years at a time. These weapons would have to be made exclusively using Hokkaido resources, because otherwise they'd have to let supply vehicles in. Maybe that's exactly what they do, but in that situation, couldn't the Black Knights find a way to sneak in at the same time? Later on, we see the Neo-Britannians opening the barrier enough to let out a peace envoy, while secretly letting loose a large submarine too. That makes it seem like the only way they can open the barrier safely is by pretending to declare a truce. Since nobody on the outside can get in, it's up to Hokkaido occupants to fight back. When the Britannians took over, they arrested the governor of Hokkaido, Jugo Sumeragi. His daughter Sakuya took off running alongside her body double Sakura. They were attacked and separated from one another. Sakura, the double, was captured and assumed to be Jugo's daughter, while Sakuya, his real daughter, was able to escape. Thus, Sakuya is our main hero, and her goal is to rescue Sakura, who's being used by the Neo-Britannians as a puppet governor. You might be wondering, as I was, why the Britannians bother keeping Japanese politicians alive. Well, it's not made clear until later, but this branch of the Sumeragi family is actually Britannian royalty. Jugo's late wife, Sherry, is Charles's daughter. Given how the Neo-Britannians are just slaughtering Japanese citizens either way, though, I don't see how entertaining the existing government accomplishes much. I guess it's all a part of their plan to build weapons in secret. They must want to act like their takeover has some sense of reason or legitimacy. Again, though, this is not developed in the anime itself, so I'm giving the writers way more credit than they deserve. Anyway, Sakuya survives, and within the 4 years before the story begins, she encounters Lelouch, who decides to grant her Geass powers. I suppose Lelouch is actually Sakuya's uncle. Not that it matters to the plot anyway, just a fun fact. This is the extent of Lelouch's involvement. Nothing is ever mentioned about his journey to follow the Geass fragments. His inclusion period is enough to bring about more questions. First, what the hell does he think about Neo-Britannia? The very Japan he almost died trying to liberate is now back to where it was. Surely he'd want to help liberate Japan again, right? Another glaring plot hole is that if Lelouch was able to meet Sakuya, doesn't that mean he's stuck in the Stimpy barrier as well? Again, if individual people can still enter or exit Hokkaido as they please, how have 4 years passed without anyone from the UFN sneaking in? I noticed the wiki here says Sakuya got her Geass and then returned to Hokkaido, which does imply humans can surpass the barrier. But if that's true, the entire premise of Neo-Britannia's takeover falls apart. Maybe Lelouch thinks that helping Sakuya is his way of helping Japan altogether. My speculation here is the writer's failure. Also, Sakuya's Geass power happens to be identical to Lelouch's. As I understand it, Geass powers are supposed to be unique to the individual, so it's awfully convenient to see the same power show up twice. Sakuya's plan is to fight back against the Neo-Britannians as a nameless mercenary. The first person she uses her Geass power on is Ash Phoenix. She encounters him, and before they can exchange words, she orders Ash to protect her, to view her as his little brother, Rozé. The irony here is that Ash was actually planning to protect her all along. He befriended Jugo in prison and wants to fulfill Jugo's dying wish. Of course, Sakuya doesn't realize this, and because Ash blames himself for Jugo's death, she misinterprets that as Ash being her father's killer when that's not actually the case. It's an interesting, if not contrived, development. Sakuya also has no idea that Ash actually had a little brother, one who was murdered by our story's big bad. 'Tis quite convenient, then, that Sakuya chooses to disguise herself as a younger Britannian boy. On the surface, this disguise makes sense. She can't exactly let her true identity be discovered while trying to rescue Sakura. If the Britannians find out that Sakura is a fake, they might try to kill her. Thus, Sakuya, as Rozé, and Ash travel around Hokkaido in a camper, adopting stray dogs and cats. That last detail is completely irrelevant, but I like it nonetheless. Ash is her muscle, the pilot of their nightmare frame, and she is the strategist. Beyond Ash, it appears Sakuya also has some confidants who work at a cafe. In between battles, Sakuya goes to them so she can relax and take off her disguise. She may dress as a boy, but that means binding her very large chest. As thanks for shelter, Sakuya sometimes works at the cafe as a waitress. My only issue there is how wearing a uniform and pigtails is somehow enough to hide her identity as a Britannian heir. She runs around in public and nobody seems to notice. Sakuya also has to remove her disguise when using her Geass. It requires her real eyes and voice, and she's got this nifty gadget that lets her swap them out on the fly. This means she can't use her Geass in front of anyone she's hiding secrets from. I bring this transformation up because at the very end of the anime, like in the last minute or so, Sakuya decides to seal off her Geass by ordering herself through a mirror never to speak again. It's supposed to show the strength of her conviction, but why couldn't she just restrict her powers through her tried-and-true contact lenses and voice changer? She already had a system of restraining her Geass. Back to the story, Rozé and Ash make it a priority to ally with other Japanese rebels in Hokkaido, specifically the Seven Shining Stars. Nothing wrong here, except for the fact that these guys are all just discount versions of the original Black Knights. They serve the same purpose, but lack character development. Its best member, Haruka, is just a knockoff version of Kallen. She's hot and all, and I'm glad she becomes the team's ace fighter, but I can't say I really know anything about her. Even her nightmare frame isn't unique enough to distinguish from the others in battle, whereas Kallen's, for example, had this big-ass claw. Apparently, Haruka's the daughter of Kensei Kuroto, Jugo's bodyguard and leader of the Seven Stars. At the same time, though, Haruka's family was killed by Neo-Britannians. I'd like to know more details, but there just aren't any. A lot of Rosé's already brief runtime is spent showing these rebels in battle. While the animation is competent, it all starts to look the same when you realize none of these characters are memorable and are actually diverting attention from the characters we do care about. The OG series was 2 seasons, each with 25 episodes. Rozé only lasts a quarter of that, most of which is wasted on generic military campaigns that are no more than icing on a cake that hasn't been in the oven long enough. I say that because the villain's main plan isn't introduced until the final 4 episodes. That villain is Norland, who is revealed to be a genetic clone of Charles. Norland was supposed to be a physical vessel for Charles to transfer his consciousness into, but he died before that came about. As such, Norland's just an emotionless husk of a human who wants to wipe out all of humanity. He has no particular attachment to Britannia, but uses its political banner as leverage to build his evil superweapons. In fact, the vast majority of Neo-Britannians we actually meet in the show aren't exactly Britannian sympathizers or anti-Japanese either. Most of them are actually just following Norland because of his charisma and strength. The dude recruited a bunch of war orphans into his army, and he takes advantage of their loyalty. Some of them, like the super sexy Catherine, only follow him till they learn the truth, and the ending shows them getting off scot-free. That's a bit irresponsible if you ask me. They still supported Norland's takeover of Japan, meaning they share responsibility for everyone Norland killed and they overlooked in the name of Britannian supremacy. Anyway, Norland's plan is to build a shit ton of robots called Loki. These little bastards run around vacuuming people indiscriminately, blending them into a bloody pulp, and spitting them out as red vapor. Jesus Christ! It's just like the evil bunnies from Blood Sea. Similar to the Damocles, it's far-fetched to think the Neo-Britannians could build all of these in secret while hiding in the Stimpy barrier. Where do these resources come from? It's even dumber when you realize that all of them can be stopped by destroying Norland's nightmare frame. While the Loki rampage, we get to see a lot of legacy characters show up to fight them. That's pretty cool, but nothing too substantial. Again, with so few episodes, it actually distracts from the main conflict. The UFN and Black Knights announce Norland as their primary target, but the only 2 who can actually defeat him are Sakuya and Ash. Ash was all butthurt about being brainwashed by Sakuya's Geass. Fair enough, she unknowingly replaced his dead brother. This drove a bit of a wedge between them, but it's nothing they can't solve in the face of a greater foe. Because Norland killed his brother, Ash is too traumatized to fight on his own. He asks Sakuya to order him with a new Geass because he was freed from the old one. One part I actually do like about this story is how the bad guys find ways of canceling out Geass powers. Sakuya being held captive like an experimental guinea pig happens to be the most tense scene in the show. If only we had that kind of technology back when Euphemia was still alive. That said, with technology to remove a person's Geass, Sakuya has even less reason for sealing off her own speech. Given that Ash is too afraid to take on Norland without distraction, Sakuya orders him to protect her with a new Geass. This allows the 2 of them to slay Norland, but it also leads to a pretty dumb finale. It's no surprise that Norland would rig his own nightmare frame to self-destruct, but to protect Sakuya, Ash ejects her and stays behind to die in the explosion. Was there really not enough time to cut Ash's mech free? or at the very least eject his cockpit? We've seen that done so many times before in the series, but the possibility of doing so here isn't even mentioned. I could understand if they tried and failed, but no effort or excuse was given. With Ash dead, Sakuya goes on living with all of their adopted fur babies, which is bittersweet. It's too bad the falling action only lasts around 3 minutes. They couldn't even fill the remaining credits with visuals, and the way it cuts back to the main ending theme is sloppy. One of the problems with anime premiering on Western-owned platforms like Disney Plus or Netflix is their occasional disregard for opening themes. Anime openings used to be a huge spectacle, introducing the world and characters of a story in glorious animation. Rosé's opening is anything but. It's mostly a bunch of minimalist stills and animation loops that would fit better as an ending theme. I do believe giving the show more episodes could have resolved a lot of this anime's plot holes, but even then, the main premise is still very weak, and hardly anything in the story transcends what was already done before. I made this comparison in an earlier video, but Rozé of the Recapture feels like the anime equivalent to the Star Wars sequel trilogy, at least in some key areas. To expand the existing conflict, the writers just brought back an old enemy and gave them even bigger weapons, despite that not making any sense. How the hell did the First Order, which consisted of Empire scraps, manage to build an even larger army and space station? Even the main villain is essentially just the same dude the heroes already beat. Norland being a clone may not be as bad as Palpatine's resurrection, but it's too close for comfort. The bulk of The Last Jedi was based around the absurd idea that a massive Star Destroyer couldn't attack the rebels despite being right on their ass. That makes about as much sense as the Stimpy barrier, rendering most of the world's military totally useless. Norland's fleet of Loki bots relying on his main mech as a control mechanism feels just as convenient as Palpatine's armada of Star Destroyers, being unable to leave the Sith homeworld without a handful of vulnerable navigation towers. None of these plot devices made the story any better, so why bother? If you're gonna dig up the grave of an already completed story, especially one as beloved as Star Wars or Code Geass, you best do so with a damn good idea in mind. In Rosé's case, it undoes the piece Lelouch built in order to introduce watered-down, Wish.com versions of the cast who only stick around for a quarter of the original's runtime. There were definitely moments that could have been touching if they actually took the time to develop properly, but as they are now, it's mostly wasted potential. Even if you focus in on just Sakuya and Ash, I'm not sure if their journey was worth muddying up the timeline. At least they didn't kill off or invalidate any of the legacy characters, meaning that a better sequel can still be made in light of Rosé's mess. That, and the art is still as good as ever. Basically, aside from some shallow fight scenes and sexy waifu, nothing about Rozé really inspired me like the OG. Don't get me wrong, I love nonsensical anime that pride themselves on looking awesome above all else. Problem is, Code Geass had a great story, and Rozé fails to meet the same narrative quality as its predecessor. I wasn't planning to even make this video, but I just couldn't stop running through these issues in my head. Hopefully you enjoyed it. For the sake of academic discussion, I want to know what you all felt. Can you explain any of the plot holes I found? Is it fine if other materials fill in the narrative gaps? Do you think I'm full of shit and that this was a masterpiece? No matter your thoughts, be sure to state them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.
If you enjoy this channel, help us grow by liking, commenting, sharing the video, subscribing to OtakuDaiKun, and
most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all our anime lore, discussions, and Let's Play content.
you can support us directly through Patreon, Subscribestar, or a YouTube membership, all of which come with benefits like spicy exclusive vids and early access.
As always, celebrate your fandom. I want to give a special shout out to all my $10 and up supporters. Video Gamer 75, Dante Pendragon, Chaos Sonic 1, Trodai Connacht, Steven Elak, Otaku Mom, Jens Bauman, Mystic Samurai 1983, Free Brick, Olympian Doll, Lunar Works, Link Pendrago, Observer Bellis, James Hewitt, Uncanny EXP, Crow Calum, Saul Soto, Tristan Riggin, Major, Mayfu Mado, Dionysus, God of Wine and Madness, Caitlin P, Sogai CH, Vladimir Ovna, The Taz 96, Jonathan Padua, Kengo X 77, Alistair Bernadotte, and Akakaze Yume. Thank you all so much.